Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on security incident response. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome our Chief Technology Officer, Matthew Eshelman, who will be the presenter for today's webinar. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Johan. Thanks for the introduction. And it's good to be back following up our webinar last month on encryption with this on security incident response. I think there's going to be a lot of great content covered today, and I'm really looking forward to getting started.
Before we begin, just want to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of nearly 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We are technology experts, and we have been consistently named one of the top 200 managed service providers in North America, according to MSP Mentor. So let's go ahead and get started.
So for our agenda today, we'll be covering a couple different things. We'll start off by just some basic definitions in defining what we mean when we talk about breach as kind of the precipitating event for a security incident response. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the security background and the environment that we find ourselves in, is that is influencing the approach that we're taking. Talk a little bit about compliance, as that is a big driver that will impact the security response. And then we'll talk through our security incident response checklist. So this is going to be a pretty practical guide on how we think of security incident response. So we'll talk about our own process and practices, and then relate that for organizations as they think about their own response and capabilities or requirements.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That's great. I think the first question to start with is, what is a breach?
Yeah, what's a breach? Is it that? No, that's a beach. It's not a breach. So what is a breach? The kind of technical definition that we have here on the screen is from the US CERT team. And so they have a very precise definition around kind of a security incident. So that's the act of violating an explicit or implied security policy, according to the NIST Special Publication 800-61, which is actually linked at the end of our presentation. So that's actually a really helpful background reading document as you think about for your organization how you wanted to start kind of defining or architecting that. So that's a really great background. It's going to be overblown for most organizations. It's really geared towards government agencies, big enterprise. So anyways, that's a great resource. But then, of course, that definition relies on the existence of a security policy that, while generally understood, varies among organizations. And again, as with many things, there's great policy templates. They're rather generic, and it's really important to tailor them towards your unique needs as an organization. So when we think about security incidents, and we had, I think, a lot of great feedback as part of the survey on the front end of this webinar, but those are kind of attempts to gain unauthorized access to a system or its data, so your file system, database, whatever. Unwanted disruption or denial of service. So this actually comes up quite prominently in some other areas where a website denial of service attack, kind of some other kind of disruption to kind of accessing the systems that you have. Unauthorized usage of a system for storing or processing or storage of data. We don't see it quite as much anymore, but a lot of hacks or attacks in the past would host movie files or some other stuff where an attacker would just kind of use your computer for space, and then making changes to system hardware, firmware, or software without the owner's knowledge, instruction, or consent. So that's kind of like the big official definition that can be used, but we find that it's helpful to kind of focus on these kind of four, kind of top level categories here. And those being unauthorized access. So a more, I don't know, not precise definition, but I think a little bit more accurate or less complex definition is a little bit easier to get your arms around is, a security incident involves unauthorized or unexpected access or use of an organization's IT systems. So that's really, I think a relevant definition for the organizations that we're working with in terms of like a small and mid-sized organizations, where we're really focused on, that unauthorized access, compromised user account, phishing attack, that kind of thing, as a way to define what we're talking about when we are referring to a security incident. So as we mentioned, some of the breach examples that are good kind of use cases to kind of play through your scenarios would be, what happens when we have a compromised user account? What does that mean for us as an organization? Is that, what if that compromised user account is an intern? Do we have a different approach as if that compromised user account is our CFO or maybe our CEO? Breach examples could be malware on a computer, either used to steal credentials, encrypt data, steal information. Again, there's another vector. What is our response? What risk does that place on us as an organization? Ransomware in a file system. Again, maybe 2 years ago, this would have been kind of the number one concern. Maybe a little less common this past year, but still a very real and very damaging example of a breach where you lose control of your data. Maybe nothing left, but you don't have access or control to your data. Forwarding emails or files outside of an organization. This is actually an attack scenario that we're seeing quite frequently when we have compromised accounts, and then we notice that email is being sent to forward to some random Gmail address that's outside of the organization. So maybe a password's been reset. That attacker no longer has persistent access, but they're still receiving information. Again, unauthorized access to a database, particularly for those organizations that are maybe doing donation processing. What risk does that present? And then your public-facing website. What happens whenever that is either defaced or manipulated without the knowledge or consent of the organization.
I heard a story, Matt, about basically it was a large company that it was a manufacturing company, and someone hacked into their system. They weren't aware of it, but they basically found a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet where they stored all the routing and account numbers for all of their suppliers. And they basically changed those numbers without anybody noticing, so that the manufacturer would, they thought they were paying their suppliers for all the raw materials they were buying. And it turns out all the money was going into, overseas accounts. And it was many months before they realized what had happened. And they only found out because their suppliers weren't getting paid. And, it was a sort of a big mess. So I think, the unauthorized access to a database can be that database could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, that you're storing sort of critical financial information on. And it just goes to show the extent to which, organized crime is behind hacking now, and the extent to which it's become rather sophisticated in its in the objective that it's trying to achieve, which is really, getting money.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example that I think that highlights the risk to organizations. It's not just, hacking is something that, is going to be targeted at somebody else that's maybe has more resources. I think, any organization, is going to have some financial processing. I think we certainly see that with all the, spear phishing emails that are going to CFOs and accountants and accounts payable people. But again, if they can get into your system and maybe update some spreadsheets that include that payment information, then that's even better than having to talk to somebody. And again, I think it shows, just the level of importance of securing your systems, maintaining the integrity of those file systems, and kind of understanding, what's happening on your network. And we have, some other security presentations that we've talked about that topic in terms of defending your network in more depth. So I encourage you to reference those as well. So yeah, let's go ahead and go on and talk a little bit more about the security landscape that we're facing. Mm-hmm. So as the first point here is that, a data breach can almost be assumed at this point. For these presentations, we're not even including kind of the laundry list of all the data breaches that have occurred in the last, week, month, year, because it's kind of just so numerous and overwhelming. So the new kind of the mindset of the model is, we kind of need to assume breach. And so with that mindset, how can we better, protect ourselves in this world? I think there's, along with that kind of drumbeat of data breaches, I think there is a higher expectation of privacy and security, from the stakeholders, as a consumer or a member of an organization, I'm entrusting them with information about myself. And so I do have, a high standard for expecting that information to be kept private. And that, I think, flows into what we're seeing as increasing external policy requirements, that are going to be applicable, very broadly. So GDPR, is currently the European regulation on general data protection, and is kind of applied to all organizations. And that touches, organizations not only that are based in the EU, but also organizations that are here in the US that deal with EU data subjects, either being people that live in the EU or EU residents that reside elsewhere. So that's, I think, has increased the compliance playing field. We have HIPAA for those organizations that are doing healthcare, PCI compliance for organizations that are dealing with any type of credit card process. So there are these external policy compliance requirements that are established, and I don't think we're going to see that compliance standard lowered over time. The graph here, as we talk about the security landscape, is from the Verizon data breach information report. So this is a report that Verizon does every year. It's actually really fascinating reading from from a big utility company that you may not expect to be able to write, I think, such incisive commentary. But they've been doing this report for, I think, well over 10 years at this point, and they are able to track trends. So this graph represents, I think, the kind of the source of the data breaches that they're being reported on. So we can see that, quote unquote, hacking is still the top or most common threat, but that is, reduced in 2017 along with malware. I think that certainly mirrors our own experience. I think anecdotally this year, of the 4,000 endpoints that we manage, I think we've maybe had one or two cases of, kind of malware on an endpoint, whereas we've had, multiples of, compromised accounts or kind of other things that would be kind of fall into this hacking category, spear phishing, which would be represented in the social category, which we see there from the purple line. So the prevalence of social-based attacks that rely not on, maybe sophisticated creation of malware or some other kind of special technique, but maybe are more coercion or trickery to get access into systems. That's really becoming, I think, more prevalent because it's probably easier to do. It costs less. It's less complicated than trying to write some malware. Whenever you can just kind of trick somebody into giving up their username and password. And I think that's bared out in the next slides that kind of highlight the top 20 action varieties and breaches. So again, the number one category is that use of stolen credentials. The second one, that RAM scraper. I mean, that's essentially just malware that is stealing data contents out of RAM. So that's the second most prevalent case. And then we have phishing up here as the number 3. And again, for anybody who's been on the receiving end, yes. It's a huge threat. It's a big problem, and it's really very hard to defend against technically, but that's where I think user training comes in. That's another a conversation for another day. But I think simply to say here that stolen credentials, malware, social attacks, these are really the avenues that attackers are using to get in to an organization.
Matt, we had a question about if you could just provide a definition of phishing and then also spear phishing.
Sure. So phishing is whenever you receive an email that appears to be legitimate, but is in fact, kind of masking the identity of the original sender in order to get you to kind of take some action. Click on a link, open up an attachment. So that's kind of a general category whenever you receive a message that, kind of at first glance maybe appears legitimate, but then whenever you take a closer look, isn't from who it says it's supposed to be. The link you think that is being displayed is not the link that you're actually going to. So those are kind of all hallmarks of what's considered a phishing email. Spear phishing kind of takes that to the next level and kind of combines what is a rather generic approach with phishing into specific knowledge about the person that's receiving the message. So spear phishing attacks may kind of play two people off of an organization to each other. So you may have a specifically crafted message that appears to be coming from the executive director of the organization and then directed towards the accountant at the organization. And I think this kind of goes to show the financial incentive and motivation that these adversaries have. And they're doing research. It's not just some anonymous system that's doing this. These are real people sitting behind real computers doing this work. And so they're going to your website. They see your executive director is Sue. They see the CFO is Mary, and they're creating these identities to try to trick the person into making some kind of a decision, usually around a financial transaction.
Yep, great, thank you.
I think the other hallmark that we're aware of in a kind of the security landscape is just how quickly these attacks move. So this is from the CrowdStrike, their global threat report. And so they observe, so CrowdStrike is a vendor that makes kind of next gen endpoint detection response software. And their analysis says that from the point when you have a compromise on the network, somebody clicks on that malicious link that installs some malware on their systems, the adversary is moving laterally within that network under 2 hours. So it means that from the time that somebody clicks on something and something kind of bad happens on one computer, you've got less than 2 hours to kind of try to evict that person from the network before they start working and spreading throughout the network. So so detection at this point is kind of in the weeks and months category, while the adversaries are kind of getting started within a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about this slide. This is what I'm calling the security focus cycle. And this webinar, the title is Incident Response, and we'll get to sort of our checklist of things that are important to do when you're faced with a security incident. But I think in the same way that if we did a webinar on disaster recovery, we would start by talking about what you can do to prepare for the disaster and not just launch into, well, here's what you need to do now that the disaster has happened. And I think you can think about security incidents in the same way. It's really important that your incident response begins now before you're actually faced with the incident. And it's a kind of a combination of human nature and just all the other priorities that we have in our organizations. But it's pretty common for security focus to follow this chart on this slide, where there's very low focus on security until an incident happens. And the incident may be, that the ED's email account has been hacked, or it's been discovered that someone is, doing a living off the land attack. They've embedded themselves on the network. Someone in the organization has made a wire transfer that they shouldn't have made. Something happens that brings security into focus. And it could be that the files on the network have been encrypted. So there's an immediate pain that the organization is feeling. And when that happens, the immediate response is make the pain go away, whatever it takes. How can we get the infiltrator out of the email account? How can we, remove them from the network? How can we restore our files? How can we get our money back? That's kind of the immediate reaction. And then once the immediate pain goes away, there's a period of time, and it could be a couple of days, it could be a week or two, it could be a month even, where there's sort of a general sense that, well, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But then after that, there's inevitably a return to the status quo. And so it's really important in preparing for incident response that an organization's security focus be ratcheted up in advance and sort of be maintained at a high level throughout. Because if that doesn't happen, then you're just putting a Band-Aid over the solution, and it's only a matter of time before there's another security incident. And I think also importantly, you may be making the immediate pain go away, but that's not the same thing as responding effectively to the security incident. So the first step really in responding to a future security incident is developing and creating security awareness now. So security awareness begins with, all of these things. Do you want to talk through this, Matt?
Yeah, so for those of you that have attended these webinars before, this may be a familiar graphic. I think this is kind of representative of our view of all of the elements of a kind of a successful security plan, one that's rooted in written and updated policies. From there, we can build on security training and awareness. And these are kind of fundamentally people issues. Kind of building on that, we want to have the pillars of strong passwords, working antivirus, a backup and disaster recovery plan, and then a patching strategy. Kind of then, once you get those foundational things, then it may be appropriate to look at encryption as part of your security plan, and then layering on some predictive intelligence or kind of AI tools on top of that. But fundamentally, things are rooted in a policy and procedures approach.
Yeah. So the security readiness really sort of gets built by starting with the policy and then using that to create training for staff and for the organization as a whole, and then putting the tools in place to prevent or predict or detect security incidents as they're happening. But particularly, as we've seen the nature of security incidents become more and more credential based, where someone's credentials have been stolen, and that the hacker is basically logging in to their email account without their permission. There's no sort of flag other than funny things starting to happen. And so I think many of the security breaches that we've dealt with over the past year were not detected by some fancy tool. They were detected by an alert staff person who noticed something strange going on with their email or with one of their coworkers' email accounts. And so that's why training is so important and really comes out of policy. And if you have those building blocks in place, then you can add on more advanced things like encryption and artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, as has been mentioned, this, kind of the main thrust of this presentation is really on creating that policy. So let's go ahead and talk about why do we need an incident response policy. We've been talking policy. However, it's very critical because it provides for a systematic response so that the appropriate actions are taken. Incident response is a really stressful and chaotic time and process in an organization, I mean, it feels really threatening, because something has been kind of taken from the organization, and there's a lot of stress to kind of get it resolved and quickly. So it's very important that you have a well-articulated plan in place so that you understand the actions that need to be taken, and you're not trying to figure this all out, kind of in the moment. And again, we want to move away from kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a deliberate response. So the process that we're going to talk through, will, I think, help build that framework for you and your organization to really think through, what are the systems, that are in place, what are the risks, kind of what are all these elements that we need to consider beforehand, because we know, kind of going back to the beginning of our presentation, that we actually need to assume breach. We know something bad is going to happen to us. We're not going to just stick our head in the sand and just kind of, ignore it. Something bad is going to happen. So how can we make sure that we're protected and have a good process in place to respond? So these or what we would consider the 5 elements of an incident response policy. There are going to be some template resources that are provided as links at the end of the presentation that kind of can fill out some of this in a little bit more detail. But these are the 5 common elements that you'll find in most of the templates that are out there. The first one is to define the stakeholders, and so we'll talk through that in a little bit more detail. So both from what it looks like for you and your organization, and then also what it looks like for us as a service provider being responsible for technically responding to these breaches. You want to have a way to categorize your risk. Again, since you've already should have a information systems list or database or some way of articulating all the systems that you have, that's a great place to assign some risk levels. What are the critical systems? What are systems we're not, aren't not as concerned about, don't need to be in that bunker mentality. And then talk about what are those response steps? Like, what are we going to do whenever, executive emails get compromised? What are we going to do if file server gets compromised? What are we going to do when our database gets compromised? That can be informed by your reporting requirements. And so this is a kind of the legal compliance component. So we are not lawyers, nor do we pretend to be, even in webinars. So this is something that is critical for you to work with your legal counsel on to understand what your obligations are from a legal standpoint, if and when your organization does experience one of these issues. And then finally, incorporate the lessons learned. As we've built up our incident response plan, it's definitely undergone, multiple revisions, and it's something that we do, kind of after responding to each breach to make sure that we're updating our systems and processes and make sure that we're incorporating the new lessons that we learn from every response, so that we have a really thorough and systematic response when responding to issues. So when it comes to incident response, here at Community IT, the stakeholders at Community IT, whenever we're in the response role, we actually, it's pretty straightforward. We have 2 roles. We have a client communication role, and then we have a technical lead. So, we've found it really helpful to segment out those roles so that the person that's in communication with the client is able to focus on the client communication, kind of managing the response, and then we have a separate person or team of people that are involved in the actual technical response. So we want to keep those people focused on the technical work, and then have a dedicated person focusing on the client communication. So at Community IT, we just have a kind of a 2-tiered technical response. For an organization that is on the receiving end of a data breach, there could be a number of different players. So the primary contact or the business that maybe is working with the IT partner, your legal counsel should or will likely need to be involved. They may be able to free up funds to respond to breaches. They may want to handle the communication between your organization and your IT provider so that those communications are privileged. The business system owner of the system that has been compromised will probably need to be involved. You may have a board reporting requirement that may be part of that. And if you're an organization that has HIPAA compliance or maybe other compliance mandates, you may even have this compliance officer role that would need to be involved. So again, may be unique for your organization, but then it's important to articulate all of the different roles that are going to be involved as part of a security incident response.
Yeah, it's impossible to stress the importance of this too much, because like you said, Matt, in the midst of an incident, if you don't have clearly defined roles, it's easy for either A, people to step on each other's toes, or B, things fall through the cracks. So, for example, if an organization's fundraising database has been compromised, you probably want to have someone who's assessing the level of compromise, restoring services if they've been taken down, and restoring data if it's been corrupted in any way. So that would be one role. But then you also need to communicate that to your donors, to your financial stakeholders in the organization, for the organization, who's going to be responsible for that and what message will go out. That's another thing. If credit card information was included in the breach, then there's some PCI compliance issues to worry about. Who's going to, take ownership of that? So there's, with any given system, you could imagine there's a different set of key stakeholders, and it's good to know in advance who those are and to sort of have that conversation.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.